On a freezing night in Berlin, the wall that had divided a city for decades was suddenly covered with people. They were climbing onto it from every direction. Some were cheering, some were crying, some looked as if they could barely believe the concrete barrier in front of them was no longer untouchable. Below, border guards stood under crushing pressure, surrounded by swelling crowds and a chain of command that seemed to be dissolving by the minute. This was not supposed to happen. For years, Europe had lived with an unspoken rule. When communist control was pushed to the edge, someone, somewhere, would restore order. And on that night, with tension rising by the second, millions of people understood the danger. One wrong move could turn celebration into panic. One order could change the fate of a continent. But no one in the crowd knew what was happening behind the scenes, or why one of the most powerful empires on Earth seemed to be hesitating at the very moment its authority was being tested. So before we go further, subscribe and stay with this story, because to understand why that night unfolded the way it did, we have to go back to the moment when the Soviet Empire first began to crack. To understand why the night in Berlin carried such enormous consequences, we need to look at the system that had kept Eastern Europe stable for decades. After World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two dominant powers shaping global politics. In the center of Europe, a group of countries came under governments closely aligned with Moscow. These states formed a political and strategic bloc that separated the Soviet Union from Western Europe. Among them, East Germany held a particularly important position. Located directly on the front line of the Cold War, it was the most visible meeting point between two rival systems. The border that divided Germany, and especially the Berlin Wall, became a powerful symbol of that division. For decades, this arrangement appeared remarkably stable. The governments across Eastern Europe maintained tight political control, and the Soviet Union remained the dominant power behind the entire structure. The system had endured crises before and had always managed to preserve its authority. But by the late 1980s, pressure for change was growing across the region. Economic stagnation, public frustration, and rising calls for reform were beginning to challenge the political order that had existed since the end of the Second World War. Movements demanding greater freedom were becoming more visible, and governments that had once seemed firmly established were beginning to face growing uncertainty. By 1989, the stability of the entire Eastern European system was no longer guaranteed, and when the crisis finally intensified in East Germany, the future of that system would depend on a decision made far from Berlin, in the Kremlin.
In 1989, the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, made a decision that broke with decades of Soviet policy. He decided that the Soviet Union would not use its military to keep Eastern Europe under its control. For most of the Cold War, the authority of Moscow over the region had rested on a clear understanding. Governments in Eastern Europe were expected to remain aligned with the Soviet Union, and if a crisis threatened that alignment, military intervention was always a possibility. But by the late 1980s, the situation confronting Soviet leadership was very different from earlier decades. Pressure for political change was rising across Eastern Europe. Protest movements were growing, and governments that had once appeared secure were beginning to face serious challenges to their authority. Nowhere was that pressure more dangerous than in East Germany. The East German state was one of the most important pillars of Soviet influence in Europe. Its location at the center of the continent made it strategically vital, and the division of Germany remained one of the defining features of the Cold War. By 1989, however, the situation inside the country was becoming increasingly unstable. Public demonstrations were spreading. Citizens were demanding the freedom to travel and greater political openness. At the same time, large numbers of East Germans were leaving the country through neighboring states, creating a growing political crisis for the government in East Berlin. Under previous Soviet leaders, a crisis like this might have triggered a direct intervention. But Gorbachev refused to take that path. He would not send troops to restore order. He would not use military force to preserve the existing system. Instead, he chose to allow the countries of Eastern Europe to determine their own political futures. Within months, that decision would face its most dramatic test, in Berlin.
By November 1989, the pressure inside East Germany had reached a level that the government could no longer easily control. Large demonstrations were appearing across the country. Citizens were demanding reforms, freedom to travel, and a political system that no longer seemed capable of responding to the frustrations building in society. Week after week, the crowds grew larger. Then, on the evening of November 9, a moment of confusion triggered a chain reaction. During a televised press conference, an East German official announced changes to travel regulations that were meant to relax restrictions on crossing the border. The policy itself had not yet been fully implemented, but when reporters asked when the new rules would take effect, the answer given suggested they were effective immediately. The announcement spread quickly. Within a short time, thousands of people began moving toward the checkpoints along the Berlin Wall. At the border crossings, guards suddenly found themselves surrounded by growing crowds demanding to pass. Many of the soldiers had received no clear instructions. Calls for guidance moved up the chain of command, but the answers that came back were uncertain and inconsistent. The situation was rapidly becoming unstable. For decades, moments like this had always carried an underlying assumption. If a crisis in Eastern Europe threatened to spiral out of control, the Soviet Union could intervene. But in 1989, that assumption had already been changed. Months earlier, Mikhail Gorbachev had decided that the Soviet Union would not use military force to hold Eastern Europe together. That decision now placed enormous pressure on the unfolding events. Intervening with force might have restored control quickly, but it could also have triggered violence on a massive scale. Refusing to intervene meant accepting that the political order that had governed Eastern Europe for decades might begin to collapse. As the crowds at the checkpoints continued to grow and no decisive orders arrived, the guards faced a situation they could no longer manage. Eventually, the gates were opened. East Berliners began crossing into West Berlin, some cautiously, others running forward in excitement. People climbed onto the wall itself, celebrating a moment that few had imagined would come so suddenly. The barrier that had symbolized the division of Europe for nearly 30 years was no longer holding, and the Soviet Union did nothing to stop it.
When the gates of the Berlin Wall opened, the images spread across the world within hours. Crowds celebrating on top of the wall quickly became one of the defining scenes of the late 20th century. But the deeper significance of that moment was not only the end of a barrier in Berlin, it was the signal it sent across Eastern Europe. For decades, communist governments throughout the region had relied on the same assumption. If their authority was ever seriously threatened, the Soviet Union would ultimately step in to preserve the system. The events in Berlin suggested that this assumption was no longer reliable. The Soviet Union had watched one of the most dramatic political crises inside its sphere of influence unfold, and it had chosen not to intervene. Across the region, both governments and opposition movements immediately understood the implications. In Poland, political negotiations were already opening the door to a new system. In Hungary, reforms were accelerating. In Czechoslovakia, massive demonstrations soon triggered the Velvet Revolution. Within months, governments that had once seemed firmly established began to fall. The most dramatic transformation occurred in East Germany itself. With the wall open and the political system rapidly losing legitimacy, the government could no longer maintain its authority. Less than a year later, East Germany ceased to exist as it united with West Germany. For the Soviet Union, the consequences were profound. The network of allied states that had formed its strategic buffer in Europe was disappearing. The political order that had defined the Cold War on the continent was dissolving faster than almost anyone had predicted. And as these changes spread across Eastern Europe, a more unsettling question began to appear inside the Soviet Union itself. If Moscow was no longer willing to use force to hold its empire together, how long could that empire survive?
By 1990, the political map of Eastern Europe had been transformed. The governments that had once formed the Soviet Union's buffer zone in Europe were either collapsing or rapidly changing their political systems. The division that had defined the Cold War on the continent for decades was beginning to disappear. But the consequences of those changes did not stop at the borders of Eastern Europe. They began to move inward. Inside the Soviet Union itself, the authority of the central government was facing growing challenges. Economic problems were deepening, political tensions were increasing, and reform movements were spreading throughout the country. For years, the Soviet Union had held together a vast multinational state that stretched across 11 time zones. Maintaining that system had always required a careful balance between political authority and centralized control. Now that balance was becoming harder to sustain. As Eastern European states moved away from Moscow's influence, nationalist movements inside several Soviet republics began demanding greater autonomy and, in some cases, full independence. The Soviet leadership suddenly faced a crisis far larger than the one that had unfolded in East Germany. The question was no longer whether the Soviet Union could maintain control over Eastern Europe. The question was whether it could maintain control over itself. In 1991, that question would reach a dramatic conclusion. Political instability in Moscow intensified. Hardline figures within the Soviet government attempted a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, hoping to restore the authority of the old system. The attempt failed, but the crisis revealed how fragile the Soviet state had become. Within months, several republics declared independence, and the structure that had once held the Soviet Union together began to dissolve. By the end of that year, the Soviet Union itself formally ceased to exist in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Only 2 years earlier, the empire in Europe had seemed permanent. Yet the decision made in 1989 not to use force to maintain control in Eastern Europe had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately reshape the global balance of power. The Cold War order was ending, and the empire that had helped define it was gone.
Looking back at 1989, the decision made by Mikhail Gorbachev was unlike anything previous Soviet leaders had chosen. Mikhail Gorbachev broke that rule. From one perspective, this decision avoided the possibility of a violent confrontation across Europe. Millions of people were able to witness the end of the Cold War without the kind of bloodshed that had marked earlier crises in the 20th century. But from another perspective, it was also a gamble. Once the Soviet Union signaled that it would not use force to defend its position, the entire structure of its influence in Eastern Europe began to collapse, and within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself disappeared. So the question remains, was Gorbachev's decision the necessary step that allowed Europe to change peacefully, or was it the gamble that ultimately brought down the Soviet Empire?